Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Scholar to Scholar conversation. I'm Robert Newman, President and Director of the National Humanities Center, and your host for this event. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you'll need to log in to participate in the discussion. You can do that by clicking on the blue sign-in button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen using a Gmail account. This afternoon's topic is Between Teachers and Students, the Obligations of Mentorship. And we've invited three of this year's fellows to discuss the complexities of those relationships in different cultures and across time, as well as implications for how we go about mentoring and being mentored in our own lives. I'm going to briefly introduce all three panelists before they each take a few moments to share some opening thoughts. And then we'll proceed to what I hope will be a lively conversation among our scholars and you, our audience. So please feel free to ask questions or share your thoughts in the discussion section. And I'll be monitoring that part of the conversation. And towards the end of our conversation, bring your questions to our panelists. Our first guest today is Emily Baragwanath, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. After receiving a BA in Ancient History and English and an MA in Ancient History from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Emily earned her PhD in Classics from Oxford University before joining the faculty at University of North Carolina in 2007. Emily is the author of Motivation and Narrative in Herodotus, a provocative examination of the literary techniques ancient Greek historians used to bring their works to life and offer insight into the motivations of historical actors. More recently, her co-edited volumes, Myth, Truth, and Narrative in Herodotus in 2012, and Cleo and Talia, Attic Comedy and Historiography in 2017, explore the use of mythology as a mode of narrative and explanation, and the relationship between historians and their poetic predecessors and contemporaries. Her current project investigates the representation of women and their narrative and explanatory roles across the works of the Greek philosopher and historian Xenophon. Our second presenter is Rivi Handler-Spitz, an associate professor in the Asian Languages and Cultures Department at Macalester College. Rivi studies early modern Chinese literature and intellectual history from a broadly comparative and interdisciplinary perspective. She is currently at work on a new project examining the ethics of teacher-student relationships as portrayed in Yilu, the Chinese literary genre of recorded conversations between masters and their pupils dating back to Confucius. This project grows out of Rivi's previous scholarship on the late Ming Dynasty polymath Li Zhi, which includes her monograph, Symptoms of an Unruly Age, Li Zhi, and Cultures of Early Modernity, a translation of Li Zhi's major writings and a volume of essays on Li Zhi co-edited with Han Saucy and Pauline C. Lee. Our final presenter, Robert Schein, is Kurt C. and Elsa Silberman Professor of Jewish Studies at Middlebury College, where he also served for many years as Dean of the Faculty and Provost. Robert works on German Jewish thought and intellectual history, particularly the legacy of Jewish rationalism. He's the author of Jewish Thought Adrift, Max Wiener, I should say, 1882 to 1950, and has translated selected writings by and about Hermann Cohen, the last great thinker in the Jewish rationalist tradition. His current project considers the pleasures and perils of discipleship through the life and teaching of Robert's late professor, Eugen Coleman, a refugee scholar from Nazi Germany. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for today's event. And we'll start with Emily offering a few remarks, then Rivi, then finally Robert, before proceeding to a broad conversation and to questions from you. Emily.
Hi. So Xenophon of Athens, the author I'm working on at the center, was a historian, philosopher, and general who lived from the 5th into the 4th century BCE. He's an interesting figure for our panel. First, there's his explicit interest in pedagogy, including in a cross-cultural perspective. His historical novel, for instance, sets itself to addressing what education enabled Cyrus the Great to govern the Persian Empire so effectively. The magic recipe combined mentoring, one-on-one informal conversations with each of his parents, and an apprenticeship with his grandfather in media, with the formal Persian education system, which inculcated justice, which is one of those virtues important to relationships between people. And Xenophon, most of the essential lessons are about human relationships, how to lead and influence people, and to be a good friend. Second, Xenophon's writings are animated by the fact that the Athenian democracy in 399 BCE tried, convicted, and executed his mentor Socrates, whom Xenophon, like Plato, then took it upon himself to defend and memorialize. And Socratic work infuses his whole oeuvre. We sense the heavy weight of obligation owed a mentor who's deeply influenced one's worldview. Xenophon probes whether and how far a mentor should be held responsible for the conduct of his students. One of the charges against Socrates was of corrupting the young. And indeed, one of his students, Critias, had gone on to become the leader of the murderous junta that governed Athens after her defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Xenophon makes the case that Socrates' mentoring is what kept Critias on the straight and narrow for so long. Only after leaving Socrates' ambit did problems arise. Xenophon makes the case that virtue is dynamic. It can be taught and learned, but equally lost if you fail to practice it. Now, 2 of Xenophon's works depict the process of mentoring and training women, with the women themselves also serving as moral and intellectual authorities, which is striking considering the prevailing assumption in ancient Athens of female deficiency. And here I'm going to try to share my screen. One tick. Here we are. Because these assumptions, I think, are summed up rather nicely in Pericles' meager and derisory treatment of female virtue in these comments from his funeral oration, which you can read on my screen. Xenophon's Socratic essay on estate management, the first work of 2 I'm going to be mentioning, with its 5 nested pedagogical conversations, argues that the household is crucial to the functioning of society, and the key to its success is the wife. The exemplary householder Ascomachus, has time to pursue his civic obligations because she has mastered the science of household management. This has required a great deal of training since she arrived in his house aged about 14, and having, I quote, lived under strict supervision, which meant she saw and heard and spoke as little as possible. Ascomachus gives Socrates a thick description of the mentoring process, how he began questioning her, quote, as soon as she was tamed and domesticated enough to engage in dialogue, dialegesthai, which is notable since dialogue is the central plank of Socratic intellectual endeavor. And in my next slide, you can see it there in the opening sentence of the work applied to Socrates. Ascomachus underscores his wife's intellectual capacity, describing the deliberations they'll undertake in their co-training of the housekeeper, not just in the practical aspects of her role, but the moral ones as well. And the wife gains confidence. She starts asking questions. She reveals an intuitive understanding, transcending his, of the reciprocal relationship she might develop with the slaves. And she holds him to high standards of truth-telling, far from taking offense at his project of transforming her, as we might. She's grateful for this opportunity to fulfill her potential as a successful household manager. She teaches him to the best of her ability, and she learns, he teaches her to the best of his ability, and she learns to the best of hers, while helping him become a better self. She might even prove better than him, he says, and make him her servant, so a topsy-turvy potential outcome. And our second portrait is of the courtesan Theodote, whose relationship with her clients is figured as improving their characters. Socrates mentors her through their conversation, enabling her to articulate her capacities, while she is shown to mentor them, giving advice on correct behavior, withholding her favors from those who fall short. Her morally instructive interactions with the men are characterized as acts of kindness, sweetness, and care. The relationship is one of friendship. This despite the fact that her sphere is that of eros, desire, which the Greeks more often understood as negative and destructive, like an illness. But the Socratics were interested in the positive role beauty and desire may play in teaching and attaining knowledge of the good. And here in the final lines, Theodote and Socrates are set in parallel, with Theodote asking him to become her partner in the pursuit of friends, and there's some flirtatious banter. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Rivi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My project focuses on teacher-student relationships as represented in 16th century Chinese letters and documents that purport to record conversations between teachers and students. Like the dialogues of Xenophon that Emily studies, these recorded conversations, or 语录 in Chinese, may tell us more about the image or ideal of a teacher-student relationship than they do about actual interactions between masters and disciples. I'm also interested in exploring the ways in which these representations prompt us as educators today to rethink our own pedagogy and mentorship. With this in mind, I'd like to tell you a story. It comes from an exchange of letters, or actually prefaces, written by back and forth between two 16th century Chinese scholars, Jiao Hong and Li Zhi. They were debating an anecdote about a legendary zither player named Boya. In ancient times, Boya studied the zither. After 3 years, he had attained technical perfection, but his teacher was not satisfied. Boya's playing lacked emotion. So the teacher took Boya on a trip to meet his own teacher, Fang Zichun. Boya's teacher led him to a barren beach at the edge of the world and said, "Wait here. I'll go get my teacher." Boya waited for hours. But as the sky darkened and the sun set, he began to worry. He craned his neck, looking for his teacher's teacher, but all he could hear were the waves crashing on the shore and the sad cries of birds overhead. 10 days passed, and Boya went from panic to despair. He picked up his zither and played desperation, loneliness, and fear. And only then, when his music ached, did his teacher return. And Boya understood, my teacher never intended to introduce me to his teacher. He brought me here to this desolate spot to stir my emotions. And there and then, he composed his most moving work. This is a story of self-discovery and creativity. It's a story of a student gaining independence, but it's also a story of tremendous cruelty. The two scholars I mentioned, the two 16th century scholars I mentioned, each interpreted the story differently. The first, Jiao Hong, focused on the importance of technique. He said, if Boya had not first studied the technique, he never would have composed such extraordinary music. The second scholar, Li Zhi, disagreed. He thought technique was irrelevant. Boya's music was sublime, he said, because in his despair, Boya let go of all the techniques he had ever learned. It seems to me that both of these scholars place too much emphasis on the student and not nearly enough emphasis on the teacher. It wasn't Boya's idea to go into the wilderness. It's not even clear Boya knew he had the potential to become a great musician. It was the teacher who recognized Boya's potential. And yet, the teacher also knew that no teacher, not even himself, could unleash this potential. Boya had to discover it for himself. Recognizing the limits of what he could do as a teacher, Boya's teacher tricked Boya into taking this trip. Was this an ethical decision? But what if the teacher hadn't lied? Would Boya have agreed if the teacher had said, "I'll take you to the edge of the earth and abandon you there for 10 days? Even if Boya had agreed, could he have learned what he learned if he had known all along when the teacher would return? And let's not forget, the edge of the world is not a safe space. It's a dangerous place. It just so happened that Boya survived this field trip. But what if he had suffered some terrible injury or died out there? Would the teacher have been responsible? Was it worth the risk for either of them? And I bet the teacher did not treat all his students this way. He singled Boya out because he knew Boya could take the challenge and benefit from it at this stage of his education. And for Boya, this was a transformative experience. But what about the long-term consequences? Did Boya feel betrayed, enraged? Did the teacher's lie permanently shatter the trust between teacher and student? This story haunts me because it contrasts so sharply with today's culture of pedagogy. Today, professors are instructed to state in detail and in advance exactly what we want our students to learn and how they should go about learning it. But the story of Boya calls these methods into question. And I wonder if the touted best practices of today actually promote creativity, bravery, or intellectual independence. And I'm conflicted, both ethically and pedagogically. I deplore the cruelty of Boya's teacher, and I'm suspicious of his use of trickery. But I admire the teacher's self-knowledge, and most of all, his well-placed confidence in his student. Boya's teacher recognized what he himself could not teach, and he knew when to step away strategically and allow his student to taste independence. So to me, this story is emphatically not a tale of a student striking out into the wilderness to find his own voice. It's a story about a relationship, a generative but flawed relationship between a talented but struggling student and an insightful but cruel teacher.
Thank you so much, Rivi. Robert, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, as Robert, the first Robert said, I've been working at in my time with the National Humanities Center on a collection of essays on the experience of being the student, really the disciple of a teacher. Through my years as an undergrad, my years as a graduate student, and then as a professor and teacher to students of my own. His name, as you heard before, was Eugen Kuhlmann, and he was sui generis. But it was not only his breadth of erudition. It's true, he could summon up any text he needed from memory, from the Greek, Latin, or Hebrew classics, and virtually anything else of significance in the Western intellectual tradition. But it was not pedantry. These were just the clay from which he shaped his lectures. Distinctions between disciplines vanished. He was a professor of the humanities. And in our age of hyper-specialization, it's worth being reminded that such scope is or was once possible. Being a disciple is not just a stroll in the park. In his Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes that one rewards one's teacher badly if one forever remains a student. To have a teacher was and remains a gift, but the trials of self-definition, while in the magnetic pull of a charismatic teacher, can be tormenting. I'll share some ideas that have come to me during my months with the center, in conversation with fellows and in conversation with texts, what we call reading. That line from Nietzsche that is oft cited as a bon mot, as I just used it, is taken from a context that is more than a cautionary tale about the need for a student to achieve individuality. It's more radical. It's about the danger that the teacher, by being, well, idolized, can become just that, an idol. Zarathustra is speaking to his disciples. You revere me, but what will happen when your reverence falls over someday? Be on guard that an idolatrous pillar not kill you. There's always a danger that a disciple's reverence for a teacher can cross a line and elevate a teacher to the status of a god. So Nietzsche depicts Zarathustra as a teacher who sends his students away with instructions to seek themselves before they again seek him. Don't take your teachers too seriously. I recall an incident from my first years as a college professor when I asked a student about his future plans. I want to do what you do, was his reply. And I was startled. Perhaps I should have anticipated this, but I was surprised that one of my students might also want to become a professor. All three of us in this discussion study cultures in which this dynamic between students and teachers is at the core. Recorded conversations, Socratic dialogues, the Jewish tradition. In fact, the Hebrew language in its early days, when Judaism was in formation, did not, of course, have a word for Judaism. It was simply called Torah, teaching. And the Hebrew word for a teacher, moreh, comes from the same root. No wonder either that the sages of early Judaism, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, paid much attention to the conditions for perpetuating Torah from one generation to the next. I quote, "Make a teacher for yourself," reads one tractate of the Mishnah called The Sayings of the Fathers. It's a 2nd century compilation. And that dictum is followed immediately by the next, "Get yourself a study companion." So 1, a student has to acquire a teacher. And 2, study is not a solitary activity. But at the same time, that compilation also contains a cautionary teaching. Warm yourself at the fire of the wise, and beware of their glowing coal, lest you be scorched. For their bite is the bite of a fox, and their sting the sting of a scorpion, and their hiss is the hiss of a serpent, and all their words are like coals of fire. Certainly, we don't know exactly what is meant by these coals of fire, but I will leave it at that. This much. My own personal experience has taught me something about the inevitable dialectic between teacher and student. A student receives, but must also resist. A teacher gives, but must avoid giving too much, and certainly avoid being idolized, leaving creation in one's own image where it belongs. Teaching is necessary. It's the circulatory system of culture. Philosophical, religious, cultural, or artistic traditions depend on a chain of transmission, the smallest link of which is that between a teacher and student. yet both teachers and students must be on guard.
Thank you so much, Robert. Wow, what an amazing range of variety and also commonality we've heard in these three presentations. So, Emily reminds us of, through Socratic dialogue, of the obligations of mentorship, and also talks to us about gender disparities and also elevating the role of women in Xenophon's philosophy. And Rivi also has plunged us into a discussion using the Confucian tradition of the ethics of pedagogy and mentorship, and specifically the challenges that come in pedagogy in terms of how we challenge students without being cruel, and how we encourage bravery and creativity amongst our students. And Robert delves into the Jewish tradition to talk about the dialectic between teachers and students, as well as the scope of the humanities and the dangers of idolatry and the over-reliance on reverence for an authority. So I want to ask each of you to reflect a bit. I'm going to begin with a quote from Robert Frost, who was asked, the great American poet, who was asked about his teaching, and remarked that, "I am not a teacher, but an awakener," he said. And I want to use that quote to ask you to reflect on the distinctions between mentorship and teaching, and to ask also, for being a teacher, for a teacher rather, is being a mentor an option, or is it an obligation? So who would like to jump in first? Well, don't be shy. Rivi, let's start with you.
Well, I love the quotation about the teacher, and I'm not a teacher, I'm an awakener. It reminds me actually of something that Li Zhi would always say. He said, "I am not a teacher." He flatly pushed away that designation. And he, in fact, this, which relates to something that Emily said earlier, he called in his letters and his correspondence to his students, he often routinely referred to his students as teacher. So in his letters, he would write to his students, say, "Dear teacher." And so I mean, I think it can be frustrating. I know myself as a student, I have found it to be frustrating when my teachers have resisted the role of a teacher, but I think it can also be extremely exciting to realize as a student that one has something even to teach one's teacher. So the flexibility of those roles, I think, can be also very exciting. In terms of whether it's an obligation to be a mentor, or it seems it's not. It seems it's not something you can choose. It comes with the territory, I would say.
And maybe I can follow up, bringing up Plato's Socrates, who was strikingly different from Xenophon's, and we may return to this later in the discussion. Plato's Socrates denies that he's a teacher at all. He says he knows nothing. This is the famous Socratic irony, and the content of that wisdom is, and it's challenging for philosophers nowadays to pin down, like the Platonic Socrates. There's an enormous amount of discussion trying to figure out what he really did think. So this is another case of a famous mentor who, in Plato's view, did not think of himself as a teacher. Yeah, and to that question of thinking about my own teaching, I think you're right there, Rivi, that one can't choose not to be a mentor. I think different teaching contexts make a difference. I would say in certain, like higher level graduate school, graduate level teaching, I think it becomes all the more important to be sort of, I mean, when I think of mentoring, I'm thinking of more intimate one-on-one small group sort of interactions where the mentor is aware of that student's wider trajectory, kind of bearing in mind other factors, and where sort of keeping up morale becomes really important. But even in a big class, even in my lower level big class, the Greeks, there are ways in which I think you can make space for mentoring, especially if you have TAs, for instance, who can develop a relationship over the course of a semester. And I think that's an important aspect of it.
You know, it occurs to me that since I've taught mainly undergraduates and have not taught in a graduate school setting, I would have thought that mentoring of undergraduates at a time when students' identities are still rather fluid, they don't know what they want to do after graduation, you know, will they go and work for an NGO, or will they go to graduate school, or what might it be, that students are often seek out the professors for conversations about precisely those sorts of questions. On the other hand, of course, in graduate school, where people's professional commitments have been made, and your professional future depends also in a very practical way on your relationship with your doctoral advisor. And we all know stories of ironic and stormy relationships between doctoral advisors and their students.
Do we know any stories of ironic doctoral student and
Actually, they're a rarity, right? But it strikes me too that Frost, that line of Frost, which although I live here in Vermont, just a few miles from Frost's cabin, I'd never heard this wonderful verse before. There's something very Platonic, Socratic about that, right? That is, you could read it as the awakening, one's role as an awakener is that of awakening students' interests. Very exciting, but also awakening students to the fact that they, like Socrates, don't know anything. And that's Socrates' teaching is mainly, the way it's depicted in some dialogues, is to show his interlocutors that, like him, they too know nothing. And I find that that's a big role of ours as teachers of undergraduates, is to lay bare assumptions, uncritical assumptions for what they are. This is a critical and for students often frustrating process at this stage of their education.
So you've all alluded to, in the religious and philosophical traditions that you study, you've all alluded to some semblance of moral education. And I think we often take it for granted, particularly in the humanities, that teaching involves some degree of moral education. So there's the overriding question, can virtue itself be taught in a classroom? But I want to ask you also, is this more complicated in this day and age, in our current time, to have moral education? And what can we learn from the traditions that you study, the past traditions that address these complications?
Well, I could maybe start by saying, I feel as though it's urgent that we are thinking about ethics and morality in society at this point, including in the classroom. In terms of what I take from past traditions and how they might help us do that, one thing I take from the Socratic traditions is just how effective it can be to start with a moral idea that is short and pithy, so encapsulated in a phrase that at first sight may seem very obvious. One could be like the Delphic maxim, which was engraved on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, but it's also associated with Socrates. Know thyself. which on the face of it is very obvious. Of course I can know myself, but then as you start looking more closely, it sort of opens up a really broad discussion. You know, what is it to know oneself? And I think by starting sort of with something short and pithy, that then opens up, can be one way of doing it. Sort of injecting some focus that then allows students to maybe open up a question from different angles.
Anyone else want to speak to moral education?
Well, you asked us whether it's particularly difficult nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And I, from the perspective of an undergraduate campus, I would say most certainly. I mean, more than at any time in my career, students want to be activists. So it's the active, action charged, politically charged life that they're seeking, and the measure of value of our courses or of what we teach is on that scale, whether it is connected with the urgent issues, racism in particular nowadays. So, I mean, that is and there's a kind of impatience. Like, why should I be sitting in this course if it doesn't contribute to anti-racism? And show me how it does, or I'll go seek out some other course. So, you know, that's not, on the face of it, that's not an old issue. What's more important, the contemplative or the active life? And certainly, even in Pirkei Avot, in the sayings of the fathers that I was just looking over this morning, there are teachings like that. The Jewish tradition does not speak in one voice. On the one hand, there's the teaching that, you know, good deeds are important, but the learning of Torah is equal to them all. And on the other hand, the teaching that good deeds, that wisdom without good deeds is lesser value. So that's an old debate, and I'd like our students to develop the patience just to see that their questions and their sense of urgency is not something new. It's not a 21st century invention.
Yeah, I guess I want to say two things about this. One of them has really nothing directly to do with Chinese literature or history, but I've just been thinking a lot recently about the Russian formalist scholar Viktor Shklovsky, and he has this idea of making that the function of art is to make the familiar strange. And it seems to me that studying history can also, and studying other cultures also serves this function of making the familiar strange. So it doesn't matter if you're studying Chinese literature or ancient Greek literature or the rabbinic tradition, through the engagement with a time period that is different, with any kind of difference, it forces us as people studying to rethink our own moral judgments, the moral world in which we live. And so I feel that that mirroring is extremely important, regardless of what culture we use or time period we use to affect that in ourselves and in our students. And then the other thing I wanted to say, actually, this became very crystallized for me in a book I was reading by Bell Hooks, actually, just last week, called Teaching to Transgress. And in this book, Bell Hooks talks about the importance of kind of humanizing the teacher. Not, this also was related to what Robert Schein was saying a moment ago about idolatry or idolization of a teacher, not putting one's whole credence in something that a teacher says, but it's also important for a teacher to to be vulnerable, to share his or her own struggles. And as I was rereading some texts by Li Zhi this afternoon, I was so struck by the way that Li Zhi jokes around with his students. He teases them, they tease him, and there's this really lovely human interaction. And he was not an easy person to get along with. But there's this really lovely rapport that I see in this Yulu, in this recorded conversation, actually not by, but about Li Zhi as a teacher. So I think those are maybe two other angles to add.
So let's deepen that comment a little bit. And we've been talking a lot about a relationship where there is typically a kind of imbalance of power between teachers and students, a kind of hierarchy between teachers and students. So I want to ask does it matter how far the dynamic of mentorship is reversible? Should we be reversing that dynamic so the teachers are also learning from their students and we highlight that learning process of teachers learning from students? Are there pedagogical advantages to a kind of collaborative approach in mentoring? And furthermore, can teachers really actively use this kind of imbalance of power in a beneficial pedagogical manner?
So
yeah, you start.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I guess I just would like to start by maybe throwing a slightly curveball and citing a passage from the Analects, which I just love, and I always say it at the beginning of every class, pretty much. And in this passage, it says, when three people walk together, I always have a teacher among them. In other words, from the person, I being one of the people, and then one of the people is better than I am at something, and I learn from that person what to emulate, and then another person not as good as I am, and so I learn from that person what to avoid. And what I love about that, one thing, I love many things about this line from the Analects, but one thing I love about it is that if you imagine three people walking together and learning from each other, they don't know that they are in a teacher role for the other person, right? And so, so it does teaching. I mean, I think also it's important to bring in classmates. Someone mentioned earlier the importance of having mentorship, peer mentorship, which is another angle where perhaps the power dynamic is a little bit different. And also in the Chinese tradition, we have all of these wonderful fictive kinship terms for my older brother in studies, my younger sister in studies. And I think that some of those, maybe Robert Schein wants to talk about that too. I think some of those are also paralleled in the Judaic tradition as well.
Well, certainly to the extent that rabbi teachers speak of their pupils as their children. And there's a whole rabbinic play on the word child, bain, and someone with understanding, like bonet. So there is, so that equation of the teacher-student relationship, the parental relationship, really echoes our idea of in loco parentis. There's a modern version of, or conceiving of this, that the community around a teacher is something like I won't say surrogate family, but it's a metaphorical family of a kind. Yeah.
And I can move from there to just note that this was one of the things that seems to have been threatening to families about Socrates, because his disciples seem to be drawn away from their families, their fathers, to Socrates instead. On the other hand, Socratic dialogue, I think a major reason for dialogue is that you've got, multiple people taking part, taking turns speaking, learning from one another, being persuaded, ideally, by one another. And in Xenophon's case, this also links to his wider thoughts on relationships, human relationships, anything from leadership through to just relating to other people in other capacities, the idea that it's important to lead and be led. A good leader, a good influencer, a good teacher is also led, influenced, taught by others. So it's really important that the relationship is reversible, and it's connected in a way too to the point that you should also be like a master of yourself, in control of yourself and your own desires. He kind of makes this connection also with like the state of your yourself. So yeah, really important that it be reversible.
So I want to go back to Rivi's opening statement where she was talking about the dynamics of challenging students and challenging without being cruel. Ian Foster said, spoon feeding in the long run teaches us nothing but the shape of the spoon. So I want to ask you, in terms of mentorship, what roles do frustration, provocation, withholding play in being an effective mentor? And the converse of that, what roles do sweetness and ease and play in mentorship?
Yeah.
Robert, you look like you want to jump in.
Well, I'm just thinking of some of the questions that students have asked me over the years that drive me to distraction. Like, what are you looking for? You know, on a paper. Yeah. What do you expect? They just, questions like that are, to me, a misconception of what learning and teaching is about. So yeah, that was why I was sighing at that very moment, that somehow you have to titrate frustration and titrate praise. And maybe I can share this anecdote. When I finished my dissertation, my teacher, mentor, about whom I've been talking, wrote me a letter. I sent him the published thing, and wrote me a letter in which he said all kinds of complimentary things and listed 5 or 6 errors. After he passed away, and another one of his students, executrix of his estate, went through his papers, she found the first draft of that letter. And it was 6 pages long with dozens upon dozens of criticisms of this, matters major and minor, which he had obviously written, and set it aside because it would have been crushing to me at that time. So, you know, we've got to be careful as teachers, and that would have been too much. 5 or 6 criticisms dosed out properly is important. So yeah, I'll turn the question over to my friends here.
Emily, Rivi?
Yeah, well, I thought I'd just note that in the traditions about Socrates, we find both of these pedagogical styles reflected. In the Platonic Socrates, it's all about thwarting, withholding, this interrogative style that reduces your student to perplexity, often by the end of the dialogue. And on the other hand, Xenophon Socrates, who couldn't be more different, he's very clear and accessible, and he tells his interlocutors exactly what he thinks they need to know. He's only, very, very, very selectively, he'll use that Platonic Socratic cross-examination only on like the desperate cases of a complete know-it-all who needs to be kind of put into his place so that he will be receptive to the wisdom. But on the whole, there's a real emphasis on ease, accessibility, sweetness, an emphasis on agreement along the way. When he's speaking with his conversational style, speaking with his students, he invites them to notice the fact that they're agreeing. So, okay, so we've agreed on this, we've agreed on that. What do we say to this? It's very collaborative, and it's as though he's taking care not to cause offense, to crush his students in the way I think the Platonic Socrates often seems to do.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I guess, I mean, to take a very large look, the humanities enrollments are not extremely high across the nation. And so we have to sweeten our subjects and attract our students. And I actually encountered this amazing story again in this recorded conversation about Li Zhi, in which a story is told about a teacher who, in fact, has his eye on a particular student. Not the way that Socrates had his eye on Alcibiades, but he noticed that there was a student who had tremendous potential, and the student seemed to have no interest in studying with this teacher. And so, but the teacher recognized the student loved to hang out in bars and drink. Not really bars, taverns, whatever, wine houses. And so the teacher changed his own behavior and started to hang out in the bar where the student, he knew he would encounter the student so as to attract the student. And once they struck up a conversation, he had this student who then became one of his successful students. I would also just, so that's about attracting students, like finding them at the right time. But Confucius is famous for, he's often described of teaching each student according to the student's own abilities. And so varying our harshness and our sweetness in accord with what the student is receptive to and willing to endure is one thing. I think one of the reasons I'm so drawn to the story that I told, the story of Boya and the zither player, is that that's a story about a very harsh teacher. And my own inclination as a teacher is not to be so harsh. And so I find that story is a kind of corrective to my own inclination. And also, I guess another thing is I think it's not just about teaching students in accord with the students' inclinations, but teaching students in accord with what time they, like where in their education they are. So the timing is also very important. And the last thing I want to say about this is there's another passage from the Analects where it's often misquoted. The actual passage has Confucius saying, if I point out one corner of a square, I will not teach the student until he comes back and points out the other three corners. And it's often misquoted as if I point out three corners of a square, I will not point out, the student needs to finish it off and find the fourth corner himself. And I think it's sort of telling that education, I think, has shifted, right? Teachers now are inclined to give all three and ask the student in the fourth. But Confucius was a very demanding teacher. He pointed out only one corner, and then the student come back and fill in the other three by himself.
So one of our audience members, this is a nice dovetailing into some of the questions that we're getting in the live chat. One of our audience members, I'm going to combine a couple of the questions since our time is running short. One of our audience members reminds us that Gregory Vlastos spoke of the therapeutic character of Socratic dialogue, and which is an interesting characterization that in terms of the therapeutic nature of that kind of dialogue. But another questioner in conjunction with that asks, what are your thoughts about the pull between the desire to give students the freedom they need for intellectual independence and doing what you can to disabuse them of wrong or damaging ideas, which strikes me as another kind of therapy? So the question is about independence. What kind of freedom do we give students? And in terms of moral education, again, how do we insert ourselves to disabuse them of quote unquote wrong or damaging ideas? How much license do we have to do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really difficult one. We can sort of go back to, that idea that we know nothing. If you start from that, a challenge with, I find, with undergrad teaching. Sometimes students come in and they think, well, since it's almost like, you know, we can't be certain about anything, that means that anything goes, and all of our different opinions are valid, and we can have the freedom, take the freedom to express those different opinions. And I find it's a really difficult thing to do, to encourage them to, you know, have their independent thoughts and use, you know, whatever their materials to forge their own directions, and yet not to let it become, you know, a world of alternative facts and fake news, for instance. I think that is a real dilemma, especially when you're guiding a discussion, to know how, like, where to call someone, you know, rein them in when the direction has simply, you know, left the sphere of reality. That's a challenge that I find very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's all about reasons, right? Giving reasons. I think a character like Socrates, a gadfly character, and my Liche is a real gadfly too. I find in my classes, I'm constantly asking my students, why would anyone think, you know, and just fill in the blank, right? If we're studying foot binding, why would any mother think that it was the best thing for her to do to bind the feet of her daughter? Put yourself in that mindset, give the reasons, you know. So I think getting the students to feel that they are free to make any interpretation, provided that they can defend it with reasons, it seems to me to be really, really a helpful way of framing that, responding to that question.
Robert?
I mean, it just occurs to me that the most damaging idea is the one that students or anyone else are willing to accept without reasons. And so the way we conduct discussion in our classrooms is that we have a real discussion and not merely preside over another version of the sort of echo chamber that's available on any, you know, on any messaging thing. So that's, I guess, yes, independence, but the only medicine against damaging ideas is practicing that kind of debate and discussion in the laboratory of a classroom. And no matter what the subject is, it seems to me that's, you know, that is our moral obligation as teachers. And then there's a kind of intellectual bravery that goes along with admitting that you're not certain about things. Right? Just to make that confession and to give the reasons why you're not certain. So, and it's not satisfying, particularly when you have ethical questions where people want some kind of Archimedean point, you know, a categorical imperative that unfortunately is not filled with too much content, but, you know, something on which to which to cling, because we have to act and we want to act rationally. Okay, end of sermon.
So final question, since unfortunately I have many questions, but unfortunately we're almost out of time. And I want to fold another question that's coming from the audience into my final question that I hope in particular Emily and Rivi will respond to. And that question from one of our audience members is, do you think the idealization of mentors happens as much when the mentors are female? We've been talking about idealization, and this questioner says that she can think of very few examples of this from her own student days. But the broader question that I'd like at least two of you to fold that question into is, why did you become a teacher? And how has being a scholar made you a better teacher? So please, Emily, let's start with you.
Well, why I became a teacher, it's a difficult one. Just from as long ago as I can remember. I think just the magic of it, really, going back to the Robert Frost quotation about awakening, the magic that occurs in the classroom, where students are making connections, kind of doing this themselves, is amazing. And I think that magic is really what drew me to teaching. But female mentors, there are some striking examples in the ancient material I'm looking at. One is the courtesan Aspasia, a courtesan who, in the same work I talked about earlier, estate management, at one point Socrates actually invokes her and says, well, if we want to talk to a real authority on estate management, we really should ask Aspasia about this. Aspasia, the famous consort of Pericles, whose very dismissive words about female virtue I quoted at the beginning of my little presentation. She has, for the Socratics, became just this incredibly influential figure. There's a dialogue, for instance, that survives where she is the marriage counselor of Xenophon and his wife, and she takes them through this conversation, and it turns out they each need to do their best to be the best husband and wife they can be, so as to keep the other happy, basically. I mean, it's funny, but it gives a sense of her stature, that you would bring her into this anecdote in this way, as actually teaching the Socratic Xenophon. So in her case, I think there's something about the sexuality of this figure, this liminal figure, who is a courtesan, so she can speak more freely than a citizen woman. She can be involved with men as well, but a very paradoxical figure. But Rivi, let me hand over to you.
Wow, there's a lot in that question. Yeah, I also do not know really what the roots of wanting to be a teacher are. I think I've always had the very great privilege and benefit and luck of having wonderful teachers all throughout my education and forming just such wonderful relationships with these teachers, male and female. I have just benefited so much from that and wanted to share that kind of experience. And so in terms of what my scholarship, how it's shaped my teaching, I guess it relates to something I said earlier. I study a culture that's very different and a time period very different from those my own. And as you can tell from looking at me, I'm not a Chinese person. I was not alive in the 16th century, and yet immersing in that culture has been such a sort of enriching experience for me. And so I feel like there's a lot of discussion these days about identity, and I feel like my own experience of not being of the culture that I study is extremely enriching for me, but also for my student, because it's living example that you don't have to kind of be it in order to study it. And so you don't need a kind of particular identity. What you need is an open mind and some study. And I want to just quickly mention, in terms of mentors, female mentors, a person who does not know that she was my mentor. She was a substitute teacher for one class session of my entire education. I've studied Chinese for like 20 years, and she substituted for one day of class in my first year. Every single Chinese teacher I've ever had has been of Chinese nationality, except for this one substitute on one day who was not Chinese. And it was she. I remember her name. Her name is Christine Torgerson. She has absolutely no idea who I am, but she has been a mentor to me in ways that she will only know if she watches this video.
Well, we'll track her down and send this to her. Robert, you have the last word. You're doing this intensely personal project on discipleship. And so what made you want to become a teacher and a scholar?
Well, in fact, I think that because I had the same feeling about my teacher then that student of mine had about me. I want to do what you're doing, he said to me. And I set that as a goal for myself, because I an impossible goal, because, you know, I went to American public schools. I didn't go to the humanistic high school, the gymnasium of a gifted German student in the 1930s, and my whole starting point was different. But I wanted to be able to give the opportunity to other students that I had had of being, as Emily was saying, awakened to these worlds of which I was unaware. So that's why I did it. And it wasn't a particular, you know, research question, except that it also had to do with realizing that that though I was born into the Jewish world, I didn't really know much about it when I arrived at adulthood at college, and this was a way in and into everything else. So that was it. I wanted to make that experience possible for other students. And how does, part of your question was, I think, how our scholarship informs.
Made you a better teacher, yes.
You know, I think, you know, I just think that scholarship is this sort of flame that we keep going, that keeps a life of the mind alive. It's not just the mechanical business of publishing. It's kind of never-ending inquiry, and that inspires me, and I hope I, in some way, also inspires my students. You know, there's often some wisdom in etymology. In Hebrew, the word for to learn and to teach are the same root. They're just, the verbs just inflected a little differently. Lilmod, lilamed. So there are two aspects of the same activity. That's why scholarship's a part of teaching, and teaching a part of scholarship.
And could I just make one more point following up on what Robert just said there, going
Sure.
back to that question about therapy, teaching, learning as therapy. Interestingly, where the wife can become better than her husband and potentially serve her as the upshot of this mentoring process. I'm pretty sure that the word to serve there is therapeuo, which is this interesting word. So therapy, but also service. So that he somehow ends up serving his student, who, I mean, she was his student until she learned. And I think this kind of shift in relationship can be very interesting as well, just to add another sort of etymological point to Robert's.
Well, what a wonderfully rich conversation. Thank you all for your incredible insights. We've heard from 3 scholars this afternoon on the obligations of mentorship, and I hope this conversation has helped all of us think more deeply about the complexities of teaching and mentoring relationships. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time to share their thoughts and perspectives, and to everyone in the audience for joining us for this very important conversation. I hope you will all join us for other upcoming events. I'd like to draw your attention in particular to our upcoming virtual conference, In Our Image, Artificial Intelligence in the Humanities, that will take place throughout the month of April. You can learn more about that conference and other offerings from the National Humanities Center by visiting nationalhumanities.center.org. Good evening, everyone, and stay well.